you're never measuring how you're doing over 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or a year, right? So the governance will help you look at how you're progressing from an operation standpoint, and also it gives you the visibility in terms of your vulnerability trends, right? So are you going down? Are you fixing things? Are you getting better? Or is it just more and more work and never got addressed, right? So I think that's one example across different
Hi, Mikell.
Hello there, Phil. How are you?
Doing? Good, thanks. Thanks for joining.
Good. Glad to be here.
Yeah, Mikell is Sales VP for BLUE LANCE. He's has keen interest in defending systems and networks since his time in counterintelligence in the U.S. Army and years-long assignment with NSA. As a C-suite executive, he has led successful business development and sales management efforts at a variety of international software and consulting companies. Mikell, thanks so much for doing this. Really looking forward to your panel. I will hand over the screen to you to introduce the rest of your team.
Thank you very much, Phil. So our topic for this panel is the role of IT security auditing to reduce the attack surface and in-network dwell time for hackers. Cybersecurity attacks are increasing at an alarming rate year over year, with ransomware attacks costs tripling in 2021 over 2020. There are many and varied attack vectors, and principal among them are phishing, with business email compromise the most frequently used method to gain credentials to access corporate networks. During COVID, the dramatic increase in remote workforce deployment, often with makeshift security arrangements, has meant that attackers are also focused on those devices, which are remotely connected to corporate networks. A cybersecurity truism is the statement, "It is not if, but when you will be breached." On October 15th, the Wall Street Journal reported that financial services firms alone had filed suspicious activity reports with the federal government listing $600 million in transactions linked to ransomware attacks. The total value of ransomware attacks globally is estimated to be over $3 billion so far in 2021. It's obvious that the old saw about the best cybersecurity defense is to keep the attackers out of your network doesn't capture the reality that hackers will eventually get in. For most corporate systems, Active Directory with group policies represents the final nexus of defense, which must be audited and monitored to maximize protection. Good cybersecurity hygiene is the critical first step to implementing and effective cyber defense and security auditing. Continuous monitoring and compliance with regulations represent the security baseline for any firm. Hence, we have today's topic, the role of IT security auditing to reduce the attack surface area and in-network dwell time for hackers. We have three outstanding panelists for today's discussion. Two of our panelists are from the rapidly growing managed service provider and managed security services provider MERIPLEX. It's headquartered in Houston, but with major offices in Dallas and elsewhere. First is Vijay Iyengar. He's the vice president of cybersecurity at MERIPLEX, based in Houston, Texas. Hi there, Vijay.
Hi, Mikell. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. And let me continue. Vijay is a transformational leader with 20 years of industry experience and has a passion in cyber threat response. He has developed coherent, credible, and practical strategies in the field of cyber defense, threat intel, risk assessment, incident response, and advanced forensics, governance, and compliance. Over the years, Vijay has been responsible for driving thought leadership, providing domain expertise in areas of solution design, advisory, strategy for clients in many industry verticals, such as banking and financial services, manufacturing, insurance, energy and utilities, aerospace and defense, high tech, government, and so forth. Prior to joining MERIPLEX, Vijay held various leadership roles, managed cybersecurity operations and sales, and profit and loss for some of the world's leading IT services organizations. So we're really happy to have you here with us today, Vijay.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
You bet. Next is Bob Hart. And I think I hear Bob coming in. He's the Director of Cybersecurity Operations at MERIPLEX. He is an accomplished IT security leader with 30 plus years of experience and year-over-year success in leading complex, challenging IT security and operations initiatives. Uniquely qualified as a servant leader with a solid knowledge of operations, strategy, and management, who has enjoyed repeated success guiding highly skilled cross-functional teams in areas of IT operations, project management, and cybersecurity. Highly competitive, passionate, persuasive, and articulate, he's a real professional. Thanks for being with us, Bob.
Thank you, Mikell. Vijay, good seeing you.
Seeing you too.
And I'm going to now introduce our third panelist, who is Peter Thomas. Peter is BLUE LANCE's Chief Technology Officer, an extraordinary polymath with degrees in engineering and an MBA. He steered the product direction, feature set, and technology enhancement of BLUE LANCE's LT Auditor Plus, along with his all-star technical team, and he's built a mature cybersecurity, auditing, and compliance automation solution. With new capabilities in the area of identifying network vulnerabilities and spotting threatening network activity to quickly fix the root causes, he's known for his insightful contributions to the global cybersecurity community in several important industries and for critical infrastructure protection. Peter serves on the advisory board for the Eastwood Academy High School, a charter school serving underprivileged students near Houston, downtown Houston. He's also a member of the Greater Houston Cybersecurity Council, an ISAO organization committed to educating and promoting cybersecurity to small and medium businesses in Houston. Peter earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Electronic Engineering and a Master of Business Administration degree from the University of Houston. Okay, so there we have an introduction to all three of our panelists now. Let's see, everybody's with us. Great. Why don't we start off the questions with a question for Vijay. Question, Vijay, would you recommend penetration testing or vulnerability management as a way of reducing attack surface area?
Yes, as part of your information security program, vulnerability management and penetration testing both needs to be there, right? Because with the evolving threats and the vulnerabilities that exist across all the technologies that's there today, it's important to keep up with that and make sure that you have the right visibility into your environment and understand what vulnerability exists in your environment that's related to, people, process, technology, right? And our focus, at MERIPLEX has always been to make sure that the customers get the visibility about their environments and definitely vulnerability. There's different frequency of vulnerability scanning that you could do and different types of vulnerability management that you could do. You could do an external and internal, that you identify the vulnerabilities, remediate them, and then again do a rescan to make sure whether it's been resolved or not, right? And then that kind of helps you, keep track of all those vulnerabilities that exist and then remediate them and make sure the appropriate patching and everything else is done to keep your environment secure. When it comes to penetration testing, again, there are different types of penetration testing you could do, and also different frequencies. We've seen customers do penetration testing once in a quarter, once in 6 months, depending on how big your environment is. And penetration testing, it's extremely important to do internal and external as well, because you need to know what the insider threats are and also the threats that's coming out from external perspective as well. And what we recommend is, depending on the nature of business that you have, at a minimum, you need to do the, network penetration testing, and it's also advisable to do wireless penetration testing. And also, we've had a lot of customers in the banking space who also use a lot of applications that's used for everyday business, right? You need to also make sure that your web applications that's used for business is protected, and it's important to understand the code is secure, all the application that's being used on the web is secure. So a web application pen testing is also important to do. So that's kind of how an information security program should be designed when it comes to vulnerability management and secure penetration testing. And it's a must-have to make sure that you stay on top of it.
Okay, very good. Thanks so much, Vijay. Let me go with a question now for Peter. Peter, the Active Directory is used to control access to network resources, so it is critical to protect and monitor in it. What steps can we take in protecting the Active Directory to reduce the attack surface area for hackers?
Well, hi. Thank you, Mikell, for that kind introduction earlier. And Active Directory goes back a long time. Microsoft introduced Active Directory in the year 2000, so it's a pretty old technology, but it's adopted literally everywhere. Everyone uses Active Directory. Now, traditionally, from a security standpoint, Active Directory was used as a sign-on, a single sign-on, or an identity management system for access to resources in the environment. And also, there wasn't a lot of focus on protecting your Active Directory because all the money and energy traditionally has been spent on the perimeter, right? Trying to protect the bad guys from coming into an organization. But we know, as you just mentioned, we saw from your stats, Mikell, that people get in. You can do everything you can, but people are going to get in. And then comes the question: what happens when they come in, right? Well, once you're in the environment, they want to gain access to resources, exfiltrate, and then we see all the consequences of ransomware that we've been talking about throughout this conference. But so from an Active Directory perspective, it's got a very large attack surface area. I mean, it's and Microsoft has over time made improvements trying to improve that, and there's a lot of time. But how do people get access? What are the core vectors that allow users to get into Active Directory and gain access to resources? Well, the first thing would be account takeover. You want to gain access and take over an account, right? Or it could even be misconfigurations within AD, right? So within Active Directory, there could be bad configurations, people not, taking shortcuts and then exposing the environment. So coming back to account takeovers, what are, an account takeover is when someone gets your identity, is able to guess your password and get in and access, move laterally and gain access to a lot of the data we're talking about. And so it comes back to how do we protect that, right? How do you reduce that? Well, I know we had an earlier discussion on passwords, and there's a general trend thinking about passwords. Passwords are old technology. They're going to have to move away. And that is true. Passwords are very old, but the reason why we have passwords is because, well, it's the least cost effective, right? Now we have mobile phones and we've got other devices where we're using biometrics. The costs are coming down. And I definitely see a point in time where we got to get rid of passwords. But unfortunately, I don't think that time is now or even in the very near future, because it's going to take a while for the system to adopt new technologies. So coming to when you talk about passwords, I mean, we've preached this for so long, which is, just having an 8 or 9, 10 cryptic password can easily be broken, right? And so what can people do to improve your password? Well, I think I just heard an earlier conference, Andy talked about password phrases. That's so important. Just think of a phrase, a long phrase that you remember, that's connected to you, right? Or you could use what we call password managers. Password managers allow us to maintain different passwords. Now, that's one of the problems with passwords is that people tend to use the same password in business and in the personal space, right? I mean, if you're logging into a bank account or your Facebook or social, whatever you do, if you're using the same passwords right across the spectrum, you're in serious trouble because something compromised somewhere else in the dark web, your password exposed there, and someone else uses it and comes in and gets to you, particularly if you're a high network individual, and that's a problem. So you got to have different passwords for everything you use as a general practice. Not many people practice that. So use password managers to help you. And lastly, the technology is there. We've got multi-factor authentication. I think we've heard that across, but use another factor, right? You can log in with a good password and then get a response back either through an email or a text that you could put in some information that validates who you are. And that will, if you have a MFA applied right across an organization, you reduce your attack surface dramatically, right? The second thing I'd like to add to that is it's a question of permissions. Least, we have this principle of least privileges, right? And making sure people only have access to do what they want to do is not as easier said than done. It's not very. It takes a lot of work to make sure that people don't have access to resources that they don't need. Particularly if you have people in organizations changing roles, moving from one role to another role. They tend to retain and maintain those old access. And guess what? Now, if your account is compromised, voila, attacker now has access to a larger footprint, right, that they can compromise. So access, so least privileges, making sure people have only rights to what they need to do. And if I could just add one other factor to that, which is, today we know there's a lot of folks working remotely, working from home. They have a company-owned device. If organizations can just ensure that users on their endpoints, whether it's a laptop or a desktop, do not have high privileges, do not have administrative privileges to be specific, you can cut down on phishing attacks. It's incredible because there's the attacker won't have the rights to embed within that machine or endpoint and then cause damage. So there's certain simple things organizations can do just to make sure that you reduce your footprint. And finally, I would just add that you've got to identify all your highly over-permissioned accounts. You need to put some good controls around those over-permissioned accounts, the accounts that have keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and make sure you watch those accounts so that they don't, that where they're going, what they're doing. You have to have auditing around that, and that's a critical key as well. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, Peter. Well, thanks very much. Bob, since auditing is so important, I wonder, have you had any really interesting advice from an actual auditor over the years here?
Yeah, I've been involved in many different audits over the years, and I think some of the most interesting advice that I got was never to share more than absolutely necessary, and so I always thought about that as like an opportunity to only say what needs to be said, not to expand upon it. Because what happens is if you start expanding on what they asked for and give them more than what they asked for, that just opens up more questions and more opportunities to pursue and go look at other things, right? So the auditor actually advised us, only answer the question I'm asking and don't expand beyond that. So I thought that was very good advice from an auditor.
Okay, very well. Well, thanks, Bob. Let me go back now to Vijay. I wonder, tell us, Vijay, how do governance, risk, and compliance programs help reduce attack surface area and dwell time in your experience?
Risk and compliance is extremely key, when it comes to information security, cybersecurity, right? Uh, you might have the right process in place, you might have the right people in place and the technology in place, but unless you have governance in place, you can't really measure, you don't know how to evaluate what you have, right? So understanding what you have is key, and be able to monitor and measure is another thing. So uh, governance plays a key role, because you might think what you have is good enough, but unless you do a constant check on what's being done as part of information security program, validate things, right, and be able to challenge the findings or the learnings, and kind of constantly reviewing what is being done as part of your operations is extremely important, and that's where the governance plays a very, very important role, right? At MERIPLEX, Bob manages my security operations, and we allocate a significant amount of time in terms of making sure what's being done is adds value to our customers, and also make sure there's a proper governance process in place, which can do the checks and balance on a continuous basis, right? Because we do the SOC monitoring for our customers from different industries. We do business with in the OT security space. We do a business with the banking vertical, healthcare, high tech, you name it. So every industry vertical has its own set of requirements and also compliance programs. And we, as part of our operations, we make sure that the governance is part of the whole process, and not an afterthought, right? So that's why the governance is extremely key. And also, the governance gives you the visibility in terms of what is being done from an operations standpoint, right? Be it your metrics and how are you trending. So we talked about the vulnerability management as part of the first question, right? So if you're doing these vulnerability scans, and then you're remediating those findings, and then you're doing a scan again, and then you're doing this process over and over again without a governance in place, it's not going to have any value, because it's going to be more and more scans, more and more findings, a lot of Excel sheets and workbooks to deal with, and you're never measuring how you're doing, or 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or a year, right? So the governance will help you, look at how you're progressing from an operation standpoint, and also it gives you the visibility in terms of your vulnerability trends, right? So are you going down? Are you fixing things? Are you getting better? Or is it just more and more work and never, got addressed, right? So I think that's one example across different, platforms or technologies that's used in information security. So governance is extremely important, right? Next comes the risk. Um, when it comes to cybersecurity, it's all about risks, right? So if you don't know where your risks are in your environment, there's no way you will be able to protect and defend against any cyber attack. So one of the key things that we believe in as part of our cybersecurity program is getting the right visibility and making sure identifying the risks on a continual basis, and addressing those risks, right? So if you don't know what you don't, if you don't know what you have from a risk perspective, there's no way you can protect from any cyber attack. So it's extremely important that you design your program, the information security program or cybersecurity program, always keeping risks in mind, right? So absolutely. So the more visibility you have in your environment, and the visibility you have around the risks, it definitely will help you reduce the attack surface, right? Um, the next one is the compliance. Like I mentioned, we operate in different verticals, and every vertical has its own compliance program. So for healthcare, you have HIPAA, right? For the OT industrial securities vertical, you have NERC-CIP, and for your banking vertical, you have FFIEC. So there are so many different regulations and compliance that every vertical has to be complying with. And it's important to make sure that you pick the right framework to address all the concerns that you may have around all these regulations that you will have to comply with, right? So designing your program, not only from a risk standpoint, from an information security standpoint, but also picking the right framework to be able to comply with all these regulations that you need to comply with from a vertical standpoint is extremely important, right? And if you don't comply some of these regulations, then you're going to get in trouble. So let me talk about one of the examples from the healthcare sector, right? HHS.gov, which is one of the websites for healthcare, and there's something called a wall of shame. So any company or any practice in the medical field, if they have their medical records compromised for the employees, or it could be the customers, you have to report to HHS. And if you have 500 records or more that's compromised, then you get on the wall of shame. So you never want to get on that portal, right? So, making sure that you understand what the requirements are pertaining to your industry vertical, and then designing such programs is extremely key. So, to answer your questions, the governance, risk, and compliance is not a choice. All three of them is a must-have and a should-have. So, anyone who designs their cybersecurity strategy should keep this in mind always. That's all I have.
Super. Thanks, Vijay. Let me go to Peter again. Peter, historically, it takes months for attackers to be detected in a network. What can be done to reduce the in-network dwell time and find these attackers sooner? Are there risky behaviors and suspicious patterns of activity that can be detected?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mike. Yes, I think in an earlier session today we heard about the use of user behavioral analytics to detect, how people, to see if there are deviations from standard patterns of activity. And I think that's a field that's really going to come up. It's been around for a little bit, but it's really taking off. But coming back to what can we do today, very quickly to identify, because as you just said, Michael, an attacker gets in. In fact, the recent Sunburst attack, I think they were on the network for literally 8 or 9 months before there was some sort of detection. And so, so the key is dwell time or in-network dwell time, the time it takes for an organization to find out whether there is an attack. There's an attacker on. In most cases, they'll only find out once they get a question asking for ransomware, or they get a prompt asking for ransomware, or and having to compromise that. And one of the scariest things I heard today, literally, was that it's so prevalent that people now have to, Jesse was talking about the fact that you've got to treat it as a business. You've got to, how do they do it? How do we deal with it? And that's a really sad state of affairs, right? If companies are forced to treat this as a business because they have to compromise and pay just to get their systems back online. It's really sad, because on one hand, when we pay, we are encouraging their behavior, but a lot of times it could be mission critical, and who are we to say you can't pay, right? It's a very, very tricky situation. So the core then to your question, I guess, Michael, would be, how do we figure something's going on the network before we get to that state, right? You've got to figure out that there's some kind of activity going on that that should raise red flags and alarm bells, right? I would start with looking at, first of all, we'll start with looking at logon patterns, logon activities, right? So one of the favorite methods, once someone, a machine is infected and then the attacker wants to move laterally within an organization. So if you see within a period of time the same user trying to connect to multiple other machines, right? So if you see that pattern, that's the same user connecting to multiple machines, that should raise a flag. There are other factors, like if you see within, from a logon pattern, you see multiple IDs authenticating to the same machine. For example, people coming in and trying to connect to the same machine. Now, is there some resource on that machine that is critical? Either case, that should raise a flag, right? When people look at failed logons, we know from a compliance perspective, from an IT security audit, failed logons are very important. But you don't want to die with looking at failed patterns all day long. But you got to be very, very, very smart about it. So today, for example, you probably hear of the term password spraying. Password spraying is very different from the traditional trying to crack a password. You find a user account and you try thousands of different passwords on it, and if you don't get locked out, you can keep guessing that password. Now what they're doing is they're able to identify all the IDs on the network, and then they'll use that one password across multiple IDs, right? So if you've got 1,000 users in the network, they have one password being used across multiple IDs, and then they try the second password. So you've got failures happening. So if you see a kind of pattern where you've got multiple users failing, and within a short period of time, you want to take a look at that. Those are kind of patterns of activity that means that you may have something within the environment that's trouble, essentially, right? And then other patterns of activity. If you see that a certain user's privilege is getting escalated, or they're able to get in, right? Or there's certain patterns of activity that we need to look at. You could see privilege escalations, permissions accessed, all very, very, issues that, could be a lot of traffic and difficult to parse and review. But today there are tools out there that can help you with that. And that's something you should be looking out for to identify if there's someone on the network. Suspicious installations of applications, or a lot of times attackers, if they're through malware, they've embedded on an endpoint, they install something, or they might create persistence so that even if you reboot the machine, the attacker stays embedded. So if you see patterns of persistence, typically, as an example of that would be on a Windows machine, if I could add, is that you've got every Windows machine has something called the task scheduler. And if you find items being injected into the task scheduler, that's not authorized. You may want to take a look at that, or applications being installed, or even if they're accessing information. Let's say you've got a large file share, whether it's on SharePoint, whether it's on your local file systems, wherever that data is. If you find a lot of large access within a short period of time, let's say 1,000 renames by the same user from the same, within a minute, you may want to take a look at that. If you can identify that, find that, that's a trigger that someone trying to exfiltrate information. It could be possible. So take a look at that. So there's these patterns of activity that we want to look at. And then
Peter.
Yes.
Peter, thanks. We've received a question from the audience. I think I'd like to toss this in at this point, and maybe you can give an initial response, and then I'll pass it on to Vijay and Bob. Peter, can you speak to how you would operationalize audit logging relative to your policies and procedures in order to stay in compliance with yourself?
Right. So that's a great question. I think the first thing to operationalize, if I can say that right, is you've got to have a good security policy. You've got to have a policy that you're going to measure yourself against, right? So because you could collect all this information and be spinning your wheels looking at everything, but you got to first, from a security standpoint, identify your core assets, right? Have a policy that says what kind of controls do you have that you're going to be putting around a critical asset, and then you're going to generate audit logs around as part of that policy. So when you do that, it's in a much more structured fashion. You know what you're looking for. You know what the deviations are going to be, and you identify that, and you're able to collect that and use it in a much better fashion. And I'd like to add something that Vijay just mentioned from a governance standpoint. It's so easy, it's so important to measure, right? Because if you don't measure, you're going nowhere, right? You've got to make sure that you're making incremental improvements with that, and hopefully that will help you.
Thank you, Peter. Vijay, Bob, would you like to contribute anything to that particular question about operationalizing audit logging relative to your policies and procedures?
Sure. So why do we do a logging, right? Well, we want to understand who is accessing, what, and if they are the right ones to access, the servers or files or whatnot, right? Is that the right person accessing, what they're accessing? So that's kind of why we are logging all these activities, right? It is also important to understand and define the roles and what that particular person, he or she, is required to do, on that particular machine. So defining the right roles, responsibilities is extremely key when it comes to audit logging. And another important aspect of audit logging is the type of accounts that you want to audit, right? So there are different accounts. You have service accounts, you have admin accounts, you have privileged accounts. There's a lot of different accounts that you use for a specific purpose, right? Understanding the role, the type of accounts that's being used, and the purpose of the account is extremely important to create these policies around these accounts, right? And then then it makes much more effective, because you're just not auditing all the logs, but you're auditing logs for a specific reason, right? And that's typically how you should be designing your policies, procedures around logging. That way you will know if you're compliant or not. For example, let me take privileged access as an example, or privileged accounts, right? So what is privileged access? Any access that will give you, access to the data that can be monetized. When I say monetized, it could be any data that can be stolen and sold, right? It could be your PHI information, PII information, things like that, right? So, understanding what the privileged access account is there for, and designing the policies around those accounts, and then enabling the right auditing on those accounts is extremely key. So, that's typically how you should go about, operationalizing the audit logging for your environment.
Thank you. Bob, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I would just add to, great feedback so far, that your logging level is very important. Like, you want to define what your logging level is from the log source. So typically you have different levels: warning, error, informational, debugging, right? You probably don't want to send debugging logs because it's going to use up your storage, but informational level logging is a security best practice. And then on the other side of that, you also want to focus on the types of logs, right? You don't want every log, but security logs would be good to have. And then any critical application logs, like things that are associated with critical apps that will, that have data elements that could be compromised, right? You want to make sure you're monitoring those, and be smart about it. Be strategic about what you're logging, because there's the cost associated with it, right? And then centralized logging, I think, is important. Sending the logs out there and just storing them meets some PCI requirements and some regulatory requirements, because you're maintaining them and you have them for X number of days, right? But there's also a requirement to review those logs, and it's kind of a loose requirement, but you have to show evidence that you're doing that. And so having a centralized management and monitoring system for logging, like a SIM, is very important.
That's great, Bob. You actually just answered an additional question that we had about the fact that if you do not review, if you don't document the fact that you're reviewing logs, that you really haven't done the job. So let me go to another question for you, Bob, regarding cloud security. What do you recommend that we do, or that a company does, to reduce the attack surface in the cloud?
Well, that's kind of a open-ended question, isn't it? Because there's not everybody can agree what the cloud really is. Is it a NESX server, a privately maintained server that only we have access to, or is it hosted by one of Microsoft or AWS or Google, or what is the cloud, right? And so, if everybody could agree that it's a software as a service model that someone else worries about the infrastructure on, you need to put in security controls, right? For lack of a better word, you need to make sure that you're not accepting the default configurations from that vendor. That the most common breaches that are occurring in the cloud are due to misconfigurations. And those misconfigurations are typically based on some default settings that you got from that cloud provider. So that's very important to put in a CASB type solution or security solution, cloud security solution, to protect that infrastructure, right? But then it's also important to do some type of security assessment against that cloud infrastructure to make sure that there's no gaps. And then you want to secure your on-prem environment and your cloud environment so that they only talk to each other, and that you limit the access to your cloud infrastructure to only those people that need to be in there. And so that's important too.
Thank you, Bob. We only have about 4 minutes left. If you guys could limit your answers, I'd like to ask 2 more questions. First, I'll start with Peter. Cyber hygiene is a term that we hear frequently. Can you describe what it is and why it's so important?
All right. I think cyber hygiene, I like to talk about it as it pertains to your personal health, right? So you take some certain, personally, you do some certain, you take certain steps to make sure that you're protected, right? Eat well, exercise, things like that. The same things apply for cyber hygiene, right? So certain steps we want to do. We want to make sure that we look at our inventory, stuff that we don't need. We need to shut out, close out, clean out. So it's a question of pruning and cleaning, a spring cleaning that has to happen fairly regularly, just to make sure that we don't have loose ends on the network that can compromise us.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. That was brief but informative. Let me go to Vijay then. Why do you think, Vijay, that despite all the tools in the market and all the efforts at education, we cannot seem to stop these attacks?
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because you have all kinds of technology in place. You conduct all your security awareness training on a regular basis, to your employees. But still, there's always something that happens, right? And I think that's the nature of cybersecurity, right? There's no eradicating the attacks forever or once for all. These things are bound to happen because it's technology. Whenever there's technology, you're going to have new features. New features is going to have new loopholes that the attackers are going to exploit. So there's not going to be a silver bullet that can stop the cyber attacks for once for all, right? So you just have to work around it and make sure you have the right things in place to protect and defend yourself from these attacks. Some of the things that we always tell our customers at MERIPLEX is that you need to have some security essentials in place to make sure that you're at least prepared for your attack, right? So one is, if you don't have an information security program or strategy, have one. And then if you have not evaluated and understood what your current infrastructure is today, and if there are any vulnerabilities with it, take time to address them and make sure that you understand the challenges that you have in your environment. Then, come up with a simplified approach to implement things like, do your patching on a regular basis, have an endpoint protection in place, Make sure you have an EDR, an XDR, whatever you call it, right? Endpoint detection and response in place. Make sure you train your employees on a regular basis and make them aware of what phishing emails are, and not make sure that they don't click on them or give their user ID and passwords out. Have the right web filtering solution in place. Do the right network segmentation for your environment, right? Because if you have an OT and IT environment, you don't have to have both of them together. Think about the Colonial Pipeline attack that we had early in the year, right? Network segmentation is extremely key. Have a strategy around your cloud, like Bob mentioned, right? Understanding the cloud, because you're not going to get all the security, along with the cloud. It's a misconception that if you go to AWS or Azure, you're going to have all the security, that comes with it. But that's not. You need to still protect your own application that you host on cloud, and then backup. Not last the least, right? We have had situations where we have seen customers or people who don't have security get hit hard because they never had the backups in place, and they can never restore. So I think these are some of these security essentials that every company has to have, and that's the only way to go about it. You can never eradicate the attacks, but at least have a plan in place to protect yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, Vijay, Peter, Bob.
Thanks.
I think the work that you do, there's the audit, it's hard. It's super garrulous, some of those things, and how do you work through those and the tools that you've got in place. So thank you for this panel. Really informative. Appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.